The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but rather it is to irrigate deserts. The idea of magic, as C.S. Lewis brings up, magic and the sciences he views as the same thing. Part of ourselves that partakes in the sacred, in the divine, that's what gives us any kind of power. That's the whole thing. It's like, well, where do you get your strength spiritually?
There are no new words under the sun. There are no new notes I have left to hum. There are no new rhymes yet to be sung. There are no new chords that strings haven't strung.
Welcome to another episode of Unreliable Narrators, where we discuss media, literature, and the arts and how they relate to Christ, the self, and the world. I'm Raymond Dokapil.
And I'm Sophie Klomparens.
Today we're joined by Cynthia Chung from Montreal, Canada. Cynthia is an editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation. She's lectured on topics of Schiller's aesthetics, Shakespeare's tragedies, Roman history, the Florentine resistance, among other subjects. She is a writer for the Strategic Culture Foundation and a contributing author to the book series The Clash of the Two Americas. You can also find her on her Substack Through a Glass Darkly. Cynthia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So the Rising Tide Foundation, I wanted to ask you a couple questions about that first. So your mission statement, first and foremost, is in the enhancement of cross-cultural understanding and dialogue between East and West, and you're interested in facilitating greater bridges between East and West, and also providing services that includes geopolitical analysis, research in the arts, philosophy, sciences, and history. So today we're going to be talking about C.S. Lewis's Science Fiction Trilogy. I've watched your three-part lecture series on the Space Trilogy, or Science Fiction Trilogy, as you emphasized, and really enjoyed it. So my first question to you today is, how did your organization become, or you specifically became interested in C.S. Lewis's Science Fiction Trilogy? Because I've talked with a lot of science fiction aficionados, and it's actually kind of surprising how little of them are familiar with C.S. Lewis's Science Fiction Trilogy. So how does that kind of relate to what you do and about, geopolitics and East and West and that sort of thing?
Sure. Well, for C.S. Lewis, I think I'm the typical case where I was introduced to the Narnia series as a kid. So I always had a really, a good impression and sort of relationship to that writing. And I only, because Tolkien is a bit harder to read anyway, I only started to read Tolkien afterwards. And then I was familiar with the Screw Tape Letters. And I was surprised myself. I actually only discovered that there was this science fiction series this past January or something, because someone had sent me a video from the Discovery Institute that was basically referring to C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength and how it was warning, way back in the 1940s, where we find ourselves today. And I was completely blown away that I've never heard about this series as well. And I immediately started to read them. And I was, again, very impressed. It was a very different writing style. I had no idea that these were even thoughts that C.S. Lewis was contemplating at the time. So it just added another layer of complexity to the genius of C.S. Lewis. And in the sense of how this fits into the Rising Tide Foundation mission, we believe that, actually, this is kind of the point of C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength as well, which I'm not going to have time to talk about the whole Merlin element to it, because it's such a complicated book that you would need a lot of time to go through these things. But C.S. Lewis is making the point in bringing up Merlin that there are two Britons. There's the better side of Britain with the culture of poetry and literature, and then there's this imperialist and also, going in the direction of a scientific dictatorship that he sees. And these are like the two identities that Britain is struggling with. And that's very much our view with Rising Tide in terms of culture everywhere. And C.S. Lewis makes that point that every country, every, you can say, cultural identity is struggling with this today in an existential crisis. And so when we study the better elements of the history and the culture of civilizations, it makes them more humane. And it also connects us to a common thread of humanity that we all share. I believe that we're all born imago viva Dei, that we all share a sacredness and that nobody is born outside of that. And all civilizations, all great civilizations have recognized that and tapped into it. And we go through periods of forgetting this, but I believe that everyone shares this. And so that's the mission, is to kind of, I guess, remind people of some of the forgotten beauties of their history.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about your educational background? You've written on a lot of like really diverse topics. So when I read you, it's like it's almost like you're a bit of a Renaissance woman in terms of your body of interests.
I'm pretty much a self-taught person. My background is actually in molecular genetics.
Oh,
Oh wow.
wow.
So, but the thing is okay, I have a Chinese mother and she wanted me to have like a practical career choice, right? So I clearly liked literature and I liked philosophy as a kid, but as a typical Chinese mother would say, those are not, a reliable career choices. And so I was interested in the sciences as well. And so I kind of went into that in university. But again, as C.S. Lewis makes the point, that if what is motivating the sciences has lost the element of the morality, it's not going to lead to a good destination point. And I found that out actually in studying molecular genetics, that when it came time to finding a job, there wasn't really a lot of choices to make that would have been very exciting, or me feeling like I was doing a service to society. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you were able to, you're definitely coming from like a background in the sciences, which I guess would make, I would understand why you would be interested in science fiction specifically. And, it's really great to see what you're doing in terms of kind of resurrecting the humanities and having these conversations. So let's jump a little bit into first, I guess, the cultural background and that of Lewis at the time that he was writing, and maybe some of his contemporaries. So most of us, when we think of the early writers of science fiction, we think of people like Aldous Huxley and H.G. Wells, and to some extent Orwell, although Orwell was more politically oriented. But Lewis was writing in the midst of all of these things, and you can find overlap in his themes between Huxley, Orwell, and H.G. Wells, but it's kind of like a Venn diagram where no one really completely overlaps completely. So how would you say Lewis is contributing to the conversation of his contemporaries? What were some of the things that he had in common with these writers like Huxley, Orwell, and Wells? And what are some ways that he diverged?
Well, I think that most definitely, as I went through in the part one of this lecture series, his science fiction was in response to, in part, H.G. Wells's First Men in the Moon. And if you've read that book, which is it's a very short read, I suggest it's worth people's while. It describes a society, an ideal society, that's made up of kind of like ant-like aliens on the moon. And they have a certain kind of hierarchy that is a very utilitarian and specialized to the point of like chemical conditioning at a very young, age for these alien children and so forth. And, it associates intelligence with who has the largest head, of course. And Aldous Huxley's Brave New World very much takes from that, and also the work of Bertrand Russell's scientific outlook. So these currents originated with T.H. Huxley and his work in promoting the ideas of Darwin, which pretty much caused a revolution in the sciences. I mean, there was already a move towards atheism already in the sciences with the Enlightenment, but T.H. Huxley really, with the work of Darwin, kind of, it was considered proof that there was no God anymore, kind of thing, and there was no purpose to anything, the universe, and thus our lives as well. There was no higher purpose, and we were not ultimately sacred. We did not partake in the divine because we were beasts, and all chance was governed by randomness. And if you're a beast, you're not really concerned with higher truths. You arguably can't even understand higher truths, even though they might exist. And thus, you should only be concerned with the seeking out of pleasure. So, when you really look at this, it's actually quite explicit doctrine for what a slave should be abiding by. And that really is what it was about in this idea, increasingly, of a scientific dictatorship, but slaves that would enjoy their slavery. So C.S. Lewis was very familiar with this, and he references it directly in several parts of the science fiction series, especially on this idea of emergent evolution, which seems at first maybe in opposition to Darwinism, but it's not. It all leads to the same destination point. And so the difference with C.S. Lewis is that he actually says that this is not inevitable, and that if we go down this path, we will lose everything. And when we later on discuss in this discussion about the abolition of man, I can go further into that, because he really goes through this in a very beautiful philosophical lecture on, in addition to the science fiction that he writes in That Hideous Strength, as to what are there's no way out of it. Like, if you understand how natural law works and you try to exit natural law, it will only lead to your own destruction. But there's this idea amongst this grouping that they've figured out how to, master nature and the laws of the universe, which is completely delusional.
Right. So you've mentioned that. Well, I guess the hideous strength is basically the fictional version of the abolition of man, and that the abolition of man is really important. And it's interesting how Lewis starts it, because in the abolition of man essay, it starts with him getting a copy of a textbook from one of his colleagues, in which the opening of the textbook has two students looking at a waterfall, and one of the students says that this waterfall is sublime, and then the writers of the textbook insist that when he says that this waterfall is sublime, he is actually not really saying that it is sublime, but rather that he has sublime feelings. I have sublime feelings. And like, that is the beginning of his argument of saying that this seemingly innocuous claim is actually something that's going to eventually, when followed to its logical conclusion, result in the abolition of man itself. So how do we get to that train of thought? That seems like a pretty small place to start, to go from there to abolition of man. So what's the logical thought process there?
Well, again, I'm so impressed with the sensitivity of C.S. Lewis in how he's speaking about this problem in the education system. And again, he was a don at Cambridge, and yet clearly in That Hideous Strength, he makes up a fake university and a fake college that's under the umbrella of this university. But this university is like in competition with Oxford and Cambridge, and is basically a clear reference that Oxford and Cambridge also share in these problems. And so he's very concerned about where the education system is going. And these two grammarians who write this green book and send it to C.S. Lewis, he's convinced that they themselves are not really aware of what they're doing to the students, which is basically you're negating value. And, this whole idea of like, you cannot say that something is sublime. You can only say that you feel the feeling of sublime. So there is not like an objective truth, pretty much, that you can put onto something. He's saying that, first of all, this would be very this breaks down into absurdity very quickly when if you say like, oh, I'm disgusted with what you said, that really means that you are disgusted with yourself, and you can have all these kinds of absurdities. But the other more troubling element to this is that you're basically saying that you cannot have value judgments, that there and he goes on through this lecture saying like, or are you saying that there are certain value judgments that you do agree with? And that's typically what happens with these people, is that they're like criticizing certain frameworks of value judgment, but then they want to keep some of those values. And he's saying like, first of all, you don't get to decide that. And this is talking about, again, natural law, the value judgments attached to natural law, or what he calls the Tao, or the traditionalist moralist moral school of values, which have existed for centuries, and crosses all culture all around the world. You cannot just all of a sudden try to change that in a way that is like a drastic reform. And he's saying that with these students, they have no idea that they've even entered into an ethical debate on, well, what is truth and what is value. They think that they're learning grammar so that they're just taking in these like assumptions as like just basic fact, so that when they grow up, they're going to, as C.S. Lewis says, they're going to take a side in a debate that they didn't even realize was a debate on truth and value, because they unconsciously at a very young age accepted it through these types of educational tools. And he makes the point that the educators, there's a quote, he says, the task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles. That is, right, it's not up to us to try to cut out things of our students that we don't want them to have as thoughts, but rather it is to irrigate deserts. And that means that we are, as educators, supposed to help the student to grow basically a diverse kind of lively ecosystem, for lack of a better word, to feed that desert so that things can grow, not to cut things out. And these educators have become conditioners. He says it used to be that educators were supposed to be initiators and people who would pass things down. He says men transmitting manhood to men. Now he says educators are merely propagandists. And that's an example he uses with these two grammarians who make this claim on value and truth, and the student never even knows it, and they themselves don't even know it. So they're just propagating this ideology, which again, if you look at the work of T.H. Huxley and Bertrand Russell, it's very consciously done. And again, it's done as a form of slavery towards this idea of a necessary scientific dictatorship. And these are people who also promote eugenics as well. Right.
I want to tackle, if we can, the daunting task of at least summarizing in part the story of that hideous strength. But before, do you have any thoughts, Sophie? Any questions?
Oh, yeah. One question. This is a tiny bit of a rabbit trail, but it occurred to me while we were talking about Huxley and Orwell and H.G. Wells. C.S. Lewis obviously has a negative opinion of H.G. Wells, and he goes out of his way to make fun of him sometimes. He, in his foreword, especially for Out of the Silent Planet, he talks about H.G. Wells. I'm just curious, you said you'd read a little bit of H.G. Wells. Do you agree with him? Do you think that C.S. Lewis is right about that?
Yes, I've read, well, first of all, again, people can read The First Man in the Moon. It's not that long of a read, and it is quite atrocious what he considers something that is more ideal than, I mean, we have a lot of problems on Earth, don't get me wrong, in how we've, managed governments and things like this, but, it is such a grotesque system. He basically idealizes how ants conduct themselves in a colony, and he makes that the superior alien race to the moon, but he has added, scientific technology to the way that an ant colony would set itself up, and he calls this beautiful. So it's It's very detached. And actually, I will share a quote with people to get an idea, because there are so many bad quotes by H.G. Wells. But he wrote in his Anticipations of the Reaction of Mechanical and Scientific Progress upon Human Life and Thought. That was a big mouthful. He wrote, "It has become apparent that whole masses of human population are, as a whole, inferior in their claim upon the future to other masses, that they cannot be given opportunities or trusted with power as the superior peoples are trusted, that their characteristic weaknesses are contagious and detrimental to the civilizing fabric, and that their range of incapacity tempts and demoralizes the strong. To give them equality is to sink to their level, to protect and cherish them is to be swamped in their fecundity." So
Yeah, sounds like something Weston would say for sure.
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Oh yeah.
All right, so that hideous strength. So the hideous strength is the concluding series to his trilogy, and the title is actually borrowed from, I think it's like a medieval poet or something, or is a metaphysical poet. I don't remember.
Yeah, it's a poet, Sir David Lindsay, and it's from the Anna Dialogue. I myself, I read the poem. It's a poem on that hideous strength from the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, that's what inspired C.S. Lewis's title.
All right. So if we could, yeah, let's kind of jump into like maybe a summary and setup of how you're analyzing that hideous strength, some of the central characters, and maybe along the way we can sort of connect those to some of the characters and ideas that you've been outlining before.
Sure. So that hideous strength, I'm gonna again kind of skip over some elements because we don't have time to go over it. But the story revolves around a couple named Mark and Jane, and Mark is a sociologist, and Jane is a student of English literature, or a graduate of English literature. And Mark is working for Bracton College. So that's one of the made up colleges that is attached to Exeter University, which again, you can kind of think of as a sort of Oxford, Cambridge situation. And there is a battle within Bracton College between what he calls the progressive element versus the traditionalist school. So the progressive element views the sciences as having been held back because of the old doctrines of morality. And so this grouping believes that the new sciences have been suffocated by red tape bureaucracy and constraints around concerns of the ethics, morality, what is legal. And they are convinced that once their discoveries are allowed to be made and to flourish and are implemented into society, then the ideas around ethics, morality, and legality will adjust themselves accordingly. And thus, to them, the laws of ethics, morality, and law are relative. And that's a big thing. So Mark is one of the themes in that hideous strength is this concept of the inner ring, and C.S. Lewis did a lecture on this. And so Mark is very much drawn to wanting to be in the inner ring, which is a very straightforward thing for everyone. It's the group. He is drawn to the esoteric and also to have influence and power. So he's always seeking out, where is this inner ring that seems to hold these answers or powers. And so in Bracton College, he identifies this as the progressive element. And we also find out that Extau is working in close collaboration with this institute called NICE as an acronym. It's the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. And it's sort of you could say a Tavistock type institute. And they believe in doing vivisections. That means like live, cutting open of animals, and experiments on humans. And so again, you can see that the progressive element in Bracton College has identified NICE as something that is along their paradigm. What would I say about that? So the inner ring, yeah. So the first inner ring, which is at Bracton College, they so everybody, there are several inner rings in that hideous strength, and they all think that they are working towards a different goal. So the inner ring at Bracton College thinks that their ultimate goal is pragmatism. Then Mark meets Lord Feverstone, who is a divine or divine from the first book out of the Silent Planet. He's now called Lord Feverstone because he's moved up in the ranks, and he represents the next inner circle, and he's sort of the introduction that Mark gets now to the Nice Institute. And there's a very telling conversation when Mark is in the presence of his superiors at Bracton College, along with Lord Feverstone. His superiors are saying pragmatism is the ultimate, and Mark is like, well, I think that this idea of that Nice has their own police force, and this idea that we could enforce these ideas onto society is actually the most important thing. And so, of course, Lord Feverstone is very much like, your nice material with that kind of thinking. And
he's just like a sycophant, basically.
yeah, yeah.
He's just saying that
And
because it's like the cool and edgy thing to say.
yeah, Mark is not like quite. Mark has gotten so used to just saying certain things, and we're going to realize that he kind of finds himself again by the end of the book. But he's become so used to saying things and just doing things to he's very much a slave mentality, right? And he needs to pick who he will be subservient to, but he always tries to pick the strongest thing to be subservient to. But he's lost his own thinking in that process. So Lord Feverstone, we see in his inner ring idea is very much of the Aldous Huxley, H.G. Wells type, where the ultimate goal is sterilization of the unfit, the liquidation of backward races, selective breeding, and real education. The real education, he says, Lord Feverstone, makes the patient what it wants infallibly, whatever he or his parents try to do about it. So it's the kind of education that you don't have a choice in. So it's a form of conditioning otherwise, right? It's a form of propaganda and conditioning, which again is very much modeled on this Brave New World kind of concept that they believe that they can do this. Right. And then there's this other part of NICE, which is remedial treatment, so that remedial treatment has no fixed limit in the sense of like the people who will not go along with this kind of education and this kind of hierarchy, you will have this kind of treatment for them, and there's no effect. It can go on and till it has an effective cure, which the people who are conducting this are the ones that decide when the cure happens. So again, this is very much Tavistock MK Ultra, where you can either take the people who are so-called dysfunctional in society, like the depressed people who have depression, or people who have like whatever kind of problem that they're considered not, normal, so to speak. They're not adapting to what the society is asking for them, when in reality, these people are actually often not dysfunctional. They're having a healthy rejection to something that they should be rejecting, but they have these sorts of treatments, and it's also an excuse to do experimentations on people. So another element of NICE that's really important is that they have their own police force, and they own the newspapers in Eggstow. And so
it's like Disney World now.
And C.S. Lewis again is very astute and seeing there's a lot of overlap with what has been going on in our world over the last several years to this, where police force, the newspapers are increasingly being owned by a selective group. And in the case in that hideous strength, he even says that NICE has organized riots in Eggstow explicitly so that their own police could then have control, so that the normal police were not able to supposedly handle this, and their newspapers will report this, so that their own police will have control, and then they are able to have emergency protocols so that they can start to cut red tape all over the place from these engineered disturbances. And so very swiftly, you have civil liberties that are being swept under the rug. And again, this is all viewed as relative. There is according to this way of thinking, there is no such thing as, civil liberties. So then the next ring that we meet, so now Mark is working within NICE, and the next ring that we meet is this scientist named Philostrato. That hideous strength is like, it's quite zany, and basically there is this person whose head is like cut off, and like they have this head basically in the NICE Institute that is supposed to be like speaking the orders to everybody. So not everybody knows this, right? There's inner rings within NICE as well. So Philostrato is one of the people who is aware that there's this talking head that is connected to all these tubes and everything, and he views himself as being in charge of keeping this head, in with like in a sterile environment, and he's in charge of like the saliva so that the head can talk and whatever. And so Philostrato's idea of what he's working towards is the conquest of death or the conquest of organic life, and he says whichever you prefer, they are the same. And his view is to bring out of that cocoon of organic life, which shelters the babyhood of mind, the new man, the man who will not die, the artificial man, free from nature. Nature is the ladder we have climbed up. Now we kick her away. So this is a transhumanist idea. And again, transhumanism was brought forward by Julian Huxley and Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Jesuit. And again, Julian Huxley worked very closely with H.G. Wells, was immensely influenced by his grandfather, T.H. Huxley. So you see, again, this ideology is always coming back to something that we are clearly seeing in our own time as large influencers. So it sounds insane when you're reading the book, but then you're like, wait a minute, it's actually kind of happening in real life. And there's, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, it's interesting that like George Orwell kind of predicted the invention of the television as a technology in his science fiction novels before the television was existed. So, in some sense, a lot of the technological things that we have are being utilized to sort of realize the vision that was already being talked about to a large extent by these people that you've been mentioning. Back in the the early 20th century. And it's also Philostrato too. I think he actually castrated himself in the book, right? He's like a eunuch because that's how committed he is to severing himself from organic life.
Oh, I missed that part. That's crazy. But I can see him doing that. Yeah. Yeah, so he has this idea that there will be, well, yeah, I'm not going to go too much into his idea because it's pretty crazy. But again, he shares a lot as well, because he's at one point looking at the moon and he's talking about this advanced race that lives on the moon, and that they're completely, living in an environment of sterility. And I mean, everything is yeah, sterile and artificial, and for him this is like perfection. This is it's again in reference to H.G. Wells's The First Men in the Moon. So we realize that there's this like really beautiful paragraph that C.S. Lewis is kind of I think speaking just from the narrator's voice, and he says, despair of objective truth had been increasingly insinuated into the scientists. Indifference to it and a concentration upon mere power had been the result. Babble about élan vital and flirtations with panpsychism were bidding fair to restore the anima mundi of the magicians. Dreams of the far future destiny of man were dragging up from its shallow and unquiet grave the old dream of man as God. So I think that, again, that's very good. And interestingly, he makes the point, right, that with the new advent of sciences, that is the more atheistic idea of the sciences, they realized that they had lost a certain kind of power that was in the past. And so this power that they have lost, they try to recombine it with this new dead idea of like the sciences the new sciences as an atheistic science sees everything as kind of dead. um, and they're trying to incorporate this like old power, and that's what Merlin kind of represents in this book, is this idea of like everyone needs to kind of return to something that we've lost for both sides, and both sides are not sure which side Merlin is going to be on. Is he going to be evil? Is he going to be satanic? Or is he going to be resisting this? And
Right, we haven't actually talked about the other side yet.
no,
So
right.
let's put pause on Mark's story a little bit and sort of divert our attention to Jane and the other side.
Yes. So Jane is having dreams, and she realizes that these dreams are actually things that are happening. But it takes her a very long time to realize this. And she talks about this with her former professor, Mr. Dimble, who turns out to be a part of this kind of misfits select group under Ransom, who Ransom now, since he's returned from Paralandra, is almost of like an ethereal type quality, and he's now known as the Fisher King, and he has almost like a saintly presence, a glow to him, and he's now, he doesn't age, and he's young, and he has the same wound on his heel as the Fisher King, from when Weston bit him when Weston was possessed by the devil on Paralandra. Um, and so Mr. Dimble, hearing Jane's dreams, realizes that she's super important, and that they need to try to bring her in, because she will be instrumental in trying to find Merlin, because both sides are trying to find Merlin. And the way that the legend goes, he never died, but he's been sleeping all this time, buried deep in Bragdon Wood, which is this like ancient wood right by Extau University, which Nice is in the process of like digging up to find Merlin. So, I mean, it a lot of I think what is going on is around the Arthurian lessons as well. And I'm not super familiar on the Arthurian lessons, but like this was very much directed to a British audience, that hideous strength. And there's this whole thing of the history with the Welsh and their oppression and everything. But basically, again, Merlin is representative of something that has been lost. It's been kind of oppressed and buried, and part of that is the Welsh culture and tradition within Britain. Not that Merlin was Welsh, but he was apparently of a Druidic type influence, which would have been Welsh. And all to say is that C.S. Lewis, who was a professor of 12th century medievalism, also very much was of this view that we had lost something with this whole revolution in the sciences, and that it's not for us to return to that what we've lost in a direct manner, but we need to kind of figure out a way of bringing forward something, but it has to also qualitatively change at the same time. So it's not so simple. And so with the bad group, with their idea of the sciences, it's an idea of, you could say, black magic versus white magic, where the black magic is something that can that views itself above natural law, or something that can break and reshape natural law, whereas white magic abides by the laws of nature. And the idea of magic, as C.S. Lewis brings up in Abolition of Man, magic and the sciences he views as the same thing. It's not really of a more cartoonish way of thinking about magic, but to use the sciences to transform things, but based on a certain perspective and understanding of the universe that you live in, or the people, how you identify what is human nature, whether it's a beast or sacred, is going to shape how you choose to use these tools. So again, that's what Merlin is representative of, and Ranson's group understands this this thing that has been lost, and they're fighting to have that basically continue forward.
Right.
I don't know if that made any sense.
No, 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 it really did. That's great. So Jane Studdock kind of falls in with Ransom and their group at St. Anne's, and they're kind of seen as the kind of underpinning, I guess, the second Britain, the true Britain, because this is the clash of the two Britons. And she's also clairvoyant, and there's also this kind of sense. I mean, it's not so subtle plot that develops where both the Nice and St. Anne's both see Jane as an asset because she has the ability to see the future. So the Nice wants Jane, and then we realize that the Nice actually wants Mark so that they can get Jane.
Exactly.
And then later we have this idea of Merlin, and we realize that the reason why the Nice wanted to buy Bracton Wood is because Merlin is supposedly buried in that place, and they want to get their hands on Merlin. And so there's this, again, the battle of, like, like you said, what side Merlin is going to be on. So I want to talk a little bit about Merlin and what Lewis is doing with Merlin. So Orwell had kind of an ambivalent stance towards that hideous strength, and part of it was because of Lewis's inclusion of Merlin. So I'm going to read a little bit, a quote here from Orwell. He wrote a review of that hideous strength in Manchester Evening News shortly after it was published. Quote, Plenty of people in our age do entertain the monstrous dreams of power that Mr. Lewis attributes to his characters, the nice scientists, and we are within the sight of the time when such dreams will be realizable. And this review was written shortly after the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, Orwell argued that the book, quote, would have been stronger without these supernatural elements. Lewis is entitled to his beliefs, but they weaken his story not only because they offend the average reader's sense of probability, but because, in effect, they decide the issue in advance. When one is told that God and the devil are in conflict, one always knows which side is going to win. The whole drama of the struggle against evil lies in the fact that one does not have supernatural aid. However, Orwell maintained that the book was still worth reading. So what are we? How would you respond to Orwell's criticism? Is that legitimate?
I think that Orwell himself was struggling with a lot, and Orwell's background is that he worked for the British Empire, and he was stationed in Burma, and he was part of the torturing techniques in Burma. So the whole idea of 1984, I think Orwell was in a severe he had a lot that he had to deal with because of the terrible things that he had done. And I think he was trying to reconcile and form meaning to his life. And I think that ultimately he probably was not successful, in that, and that's the tragedy of Orwell. But 1984, from how I understand it, is a representation of that Orwell is both Winston, the tortured, and O'Brien, the torturer. And Orwell, even though he had problems with the British Empire, never really disconnected from the British Empire and worked for them in intelligence. It might be even to his his last days, and not to say that he was like completely okay with this or anything, but at the end of the day, he could not escape that kind of inner ring, let's put it that way. And these people are put into an education system at a very young age. I've heard terrible things about Eton. That's where George Orwell went. That's where Aldous Huxley and Julian Huxley went. Aldous Huxley didn't even want to send his son to Eton. It's like that messed up. And they really severely condition you and brainwash you. And there's probably also a lot of, pedophilia going on. And so Orwell was struggling with a lot. And I think that C.S. Lewis was very aware of this. There's no way you could not be aware of it being in the Oxford and Cambridge type environment. But I think that C.S. Lewis ultimately was much stronger than Orwell spiritually. And that's the whole thing, is like, well, where do you get your strength spiritually? Because it can be invisible, and people can even say, well, you're delusional. You find your strength in a delusion. But I think that again, if you understand, and I mean, it's not just blind faith. C.S. Lewis did a lot of work on, first of all, studying the Platonic method of a philosophical investigation, which is a form of the sciences. Like, the metaphysics and epistemology were cut out of the sciences, the atheistic sciences, because only empirical data, raw facts and this sort of thing were accepted. But actually, philosophical investigation in the way of Plato wasn't the only one. C.S. Lewis also talks about Confucius in The Abolition of Man, and I completely agree with C.S. Lewis that they're both from the same, school of philosophical thinking. You can come to truth with things that are not tangible and things that you don't see directly with your eyes. And I think that people like Orwell struggled with that. And that's why they ultimately allowed themselves to be enslaved by the British Empire. Whereas C.S. Lewis, even though he was a professor at Cambridge, which was very controversial, and that university put forward many terrible, terrible policies and education, he was a kind of lighthouse. And he was, I think, a savior to a lot of the students who would listen to him. I think he saved a lot of lives of these students who were otherwise going to be completely drowned in that kind of education system. So, it's not about just like having to see something. And you can use metaphor, you can use certain types of imaginative styles of explaining something, like Merlin. Like, C.S. Lewis doesn't literally believe in Merlin in this way, but it's representing something that is not tangible. Or like, even the word rational versus irrational has become like very mixed up in our way of thinking, because the new sciences has affected all of us. Like, we all have a little bit of a problem with thinking outside of the box, because we've been conditioned from a very young age with our education system to only associate a specific kind of meaning with a specific kind of word, which is not how it used to be for centuries, is what C.S. Lewis is making the point on.
Right. It has to do with, a lot of it is kind of like an a priori assumption that we all share, that science is really the only valid epistemology, which isn't to say that there's anything wrong with the practice of science, but rather science as a philosophy, science a way of understanding, and a way of life, and a way of kind of explaining the meaning of our existence and what it means to be human, I guess, is really the nefarious thing.
Well, also, it's surprising to me that Orwell would say this at all, or maybe ironic, because I would say that the main problem with 1984 is the fact that there is no supernatural aid. Because he says, like, when one is told that God and the devil are in conflict, one always knows which side is going to win. I think the conclusion of 1984 is a foregone conclusion, because there is no supernatural aid. There's no way for Winston to win. There's no way for there to be any sort of rebellion unless there's some kind of supernatural aid. And so we all know that Big Brother is going to win. So
Yeah, no, that's a very good point.
So do you want to kind of, we'll kind of like go to, I guess, skip a little bit to the epic conclusion of That Hideous Strength, and that's where all of these characters clash together in a banquet, and Merlin kind of infiltrates. So do we want to kind of set that up, what happens there, and what that ultimately means?
Yeah, so the bad guys at Nice, they think that they have captured Merlin, but it ends up being just a tramp, and so they're not able to communicate with this tramp, and they put out an ad for a translator, and Merlin is the one who answers to this. So it's Merlin shows up at the Nice Institute, and he's claiming that the tramp is saying that he's Merlin in whatever language that he's pretending to speak to the tramp.
And he does it like he has some sort of like magical possession powers, I guess, that he can like
Yeah,
he turns him into a puppet and makes the tramp start talking as in
exactly. Yeah.
Latin or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they all show up, so they're all excited now. They're like, oh, we got Merlin. And so there's this big, banquet dinner. And you have Jules, who is like the public figurehead of the Nice Institute, who again is a kind of dig at H.G. Wells, the way that they describe him. And quickly you start to have a kind of Tower of Babel situation where Jules is speaking, and everybody's just, the way that C.S. Lewis sets the scene up, by the way, is really hilarious. Like, C.S.
Yeah.
Lewis is such a funny guy, and I can't do it justice by even trying to explain how he like was making up, because even him making up nonsensical phrases, the way he does it specifically is hilarious. I wouldn't be able to do it off the top of my head. And so everyone's just kind of, usually people are not really listening that closely anyway to these kind of boring events. And so it takes people a bit of time to realize, wait a minute, he's not making any sense at all. And then I think it's Withers. So Withers and Frost are the supposed real scientists at the Nice Institute who are at the top of the inner ring. So Withers frantically, breaks in, and he starts talking to the members of the banquet, and he's also talking nonsensical stuff. And so quickly things become very chaotic. People are also starting to argue with each other. They're starting to fight. Nobody can understand anybody. And the bear, I keep forgetting the name of this bear. Do you remember?
Bultitude.
Baltitude. Okay, Baltitude. He's one of the members of Ransom's group, and he, ends up at the Nice Institute, not by his choice, but he ends up there. He's like captured because they want to experiment on animals, so they find a bear walking around on the street, and they bring him to the Nice Institute, and he ends up freeing the animals that are well enough to escape, and they basically all enter the banquet and attack the people of Nice, and it's like mayhem and carnage. Is basically a massacre. But Withers and Frost and Lord Feverstone do survive. We didn't have time to talk about the fairy, but the fairy is this sort of sadist that's in charge of the police force. And again, just very insightful how C.S. Lewis describes that, kind of setup, but I don't really think we have time to talk about that.
And the curse of Babel, Merlin pronounces the curse of Babel on everyone at the banquet, and then he says in a great loud voice, "They have despised the word of God. Now even the word of man shall be taken away," and that's like the curse of Babel.
Frost and Wither, they escape, and we realize, so we're starting to enter the last inner ring of this, what was this whole purpose of the Nice Institute really. And we realize that the head was not ever this kind of uh, scientific miracle that Philostrato thought that he had accomplished, but rather that this head is not being is not talking through sciences, but actually, as according to Frost and Wither, it's from macrobes. So you have like microscopic organisms, and then you have macrobes, which are also invisible, but they're on the large scale. And like pretty much from their understanding, all of our human history, everything has been shaped by these macrobes, which we've never seen. And so they are subservient to these macrobes. We end up realizing that the macrobes are, in fact, Frost and Wither don't even have it right, are the evil sort of spirits of the devil. And again, for people, just as a reminder, Earth is like under siege, and Satan has taken over the Earth as the Oyarsa of Earth that has gone against Malacandra, the god. And, you have Oyarsa from Mars, and you have an Oyarsa for Paralandra, and so forth. And so it's only Earth because that's why Earth is called the silent planet, because it's lost communication with all these others, because our Oyarsa has turned bad. So they've actually been doing the work of the devil all this time. But they thought that they were doing it for the sciences or for a superior kind of alien species, you could say. Right. So after the dining room massacre, it's Withers and Philostrato and Strake, which is this other guy, go to the head, and they're like bobbing up and down and everything. And the head asks for a new head, basically a sacrifice. So Withers and Strake kill Philostrato, and in a kind of hilarious scene, because Philostrato says he realized they were going to murder him unscientifically. So for Philostrato, he's still like caught in this idea of like these strict rules of the sciences, and you can do the most diabolical things as long as it's for the advent of science. Science is his god. And so they kill him, and then they realize that the head is probably going to ask for another sacrifice. So Wither and Strake fight each other, and then Withers succeeds at in killing Strake in the anteroom, which is an adjacent room to the room that they're in. Then when he returns to Philostrato's head, he sees movement in the corner of his eye, and it's this large bear. And he again, C.S. Lewis hilariously saying, once you start to question everything in terms of reality and purpose, and you turn it on upside down on its head, it becomes that anything is possible. So, this whole thing of like the sciences are supposed to keep us grounded and all of this, it actually ends up, if you go down that rabbit hole, that you're going to believe in anything. And so Withers, in a very hilarious way, sees this bear rising up on its hind legs, and he's like, is that Strake? Because in the world that he lives in, these kinds of transformations are completely impossible. And so, we all know how it ends with whether Mr. Multitude ends up killing him. And then we're left with Frost. And there's a very beautiful paragraph that I'm going to just share with people, of Frost's idea, where he knows on some level, C.S. Lewis is saying, that he's been wrong this whole time, and that there is likely a soul with the face of redemption, with the choice still before him to come to reconcile the destruction that he has done. He still refuses. And C.S. Lewis writes, still not asking what he would do or why, Frost went to the garage. So at this point, like, pretty much everyone's dead except for Lord Feverstone. He came up with as many petrol tins as he could carry. He piled all the inflammables he could think of together in the objective room, which is what they were putting Mark in, actually, to try to make sure that he was not going to have like any morality or ethics. And he even was told to like stamp on the cross, which apparently is a thing that is done in like real life, like to get people to reject Christ. So he goes into the objective room. Then he locked himself in that tiresome illusion. His consciousness was screaming in protest. He poured out the petrol and threw a lighted match into the pile. Not till then did his controllers allow him to suspect, that's the evil spirits, I would imagine, to suspect that death itself might not after all cure the illusion of being a soul. Nay, might prove the entry into a world where that illusion raged infinite and unchecked. So eternal damnation, right? Escape for the soul, if not for the body, was offered him. He became able to know and simultaneously refused the knowledge that he had been wrong from the beginning, that souls and personal responsibility existed. He half saw, he wholly hated. The physical torture of the burning was hardly fiercer than his hatred of that. With one supreme effort, he flung himself back into his illusion. In that attitude, eternity overtook him, as sunrise in old tales overtakes trolls and turns them into unchangeable stone. And there's like
Mhm.
another phrase too, where he says, how people, when they become like the most lost and locked into their damnation, is when they're most like they've fallen kind of back asleep. So yeah, that's Frost's ending. And then Lord Feverston, so he is able to get out of the banquet room. He gets into a car and he drives off. And Merlin is actually in the back seat, and he starts to control Lord Feverston to direct him to where he wants to get to his horse, assuming that Merlin didn't actually know how to drive a car, so he had to wait for someone to come in. And in the process, Lord Feverston crashes the car. Merlin takes off on his horse, and Feverston wants to walk back to X-Town. He sees all of these people exiting the town because there's all of these floods and earthquakes that are happening in the town. But he continues to walk towards it, and just as he reaches, there's a massive sinkhole, and all of Extau is swallowed up, including Lord Feverston with them. So that was the end of Lord Feverston.
It's probably something like Exodus going in there, the ground swallowing up the Israelites and everything. Reference.
Yeah, there is like divine intervention, in the ending of this, in term, and the C.S. Lewis says like there was never supposed to be divine intervention, but then this grouping that wanted to subvert natural law, they wanted to take it past earth, and they wanted to go into the heavens and spread it everywhere else. And that was the condition upon which God in the story said that thus, we are going to intervene directly at this point. Otherwise, they wouldn't have, if it would have remained on Earth, and it would have been still a battle meant to be fought on Earth.
It's
And
because they went beyond the boundary of the moon, which they were
yes,
supposed to be bound by because of Lucifer or the Bent Oyarsa, and they provoked the ire of the Oyarsa from the other planets. And like
yes,
Lewis, his phrase is, they have pulled deep heaven down on their heads. Yeah.
yes, exactly. And that's the thing with, Paralandra, where Weston is, lands on Paralandra to try to contaminate the Adam and Eve on Paralandra. So, the gloves are off at that point. I wanted to say one more thing about the inner ring, which again, C.S. Lewis has a nice lecture on this, and I do believe that this quest for the inner ring is something that is for anybody. I mean, obviously, it's a lot to try to say like, well, what can you do to resist such strong currents, as Orwell says, right? Oh, well, it's divine intervention. Like, what is the average person supposed to do? And I made the point in my lecture that I think that even just simply resisting the inner ring, which Orwell should have done. If Orwell would have simply resisted the inner ring, his life would have been very different. And really, to refuse the siren's call of the inner ring is going to save us all, because the inner ring causes you to seek out the false. And I do think that Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the one ring to rule them all, is very much on the same vein. And, like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were always talking and sharing thoughts. And C.S. Lewis even brings up Numenor in That Hideous Strength, and that Ransom is also supposed to be a kind of descendant from the Numenor line as well. And so, yes, this whole thing of like the one ring to rule them all. And he has a very beautiful quote at the very end of this lecture, which I I do want to share. I don't know. Do we have enough time?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The quest of the inner ring will break your hearts unless you break it. But if you break it, a surprising result will follow. If in your working hours you make the work your end, you will presently find yourself all unawares inside the only circle in your profession that really matters. You will be one of the sound craftsmen, and other sound craftsmen will know it. This group of craftsmen will by no means coincide with the inner ring or the important people or the people in the know. It will not shape that professional policy or work up that professional influence which fights for the profession as a whole against the public, nor will it lead to those periodic scandals and crises which the inner ring produces. But it will do those things which that profession exists to do, and will in the long run be responsible for all the respect which that profession in fact enjoys and which the speeches and advertisements cannot maintain. And if in your spare time you consort simply with the people you like, you will again find that you have come unawares to a real inside, that you are indeed snug and safe at the center of something which, seen from without, would look exactly like an inner ring. But the difference is that the secrecy is accidental and its exclusiveness a byproduct, and no one was led thither by the lure of the esoteric, for it is only 4 or 5 people who like one another meeting to do things that they like. This is friendship.
Right, and that's a beautiful quote, and I really, it spoke to me a lot actually. You know, when I was going through college, this essay on the inner ring definitely, it was very relatable to me. But I guess so. Here's I guess a couple concluding questions and thoughts maybe we want to end on is, what is C.S. Lewis's vision of the good, or the antidote to Babel? Because in some sense it seems that, I mean, he brings up St. Anne's, and St. Anne's is an interesting place. First of all, its attitude towards animals is different, and you mentioned earlier there's a bear there, Mr. Bultitude, who just lives with them. And like Ransom feeds his crumbs to ants and mice, and they come and pick it up like he's some sort of Disney princess or something. And so there's this kind of contrast that's being built up between the difference between the way St. Anne's approaches things and, you know, the Nice Institute. And what comes up at the end of the story is this discussion of Logris. You know, Logris being the second Briton that's fighting against the technocratic encroaching Britain that's the hideous strength. So what is the significance of Logris? What's his vision of the good? You kind of intimated a little bit on this, but it does seem in some sense that Logris in St. Anne's is another inner ring, but it's not the same evil. At least Lewis encourages us to not think of it as the same evil. So why is it not? Why is this not another inner ring? And what's going on here?
Excellent question. Well, again, C.S. Lewis being a student of Plato, I would answer it in Platonic terms, which is that there is the false and master slave type system of hierarchy, where people are placed within that against their will, and it's to exploit ultimately the people below you. And then there's what is, for lack of a better word, a natural hierarchy, but it is not for the purpose of exploitation. So there is a hierarchy in terms of wisdom, for instance, right? And, Plato talks about it in terms of the bronze, the silver, and the golden souls. It's not to say that we are born into this or that you are condemned to be a certain way, but rather it's an invitation to partake in the journey towards wisdom and understanding, which also centered in truth, beauty, and goodness. So for those who seek it out, they will already have qualified themselves, if that is the ultimate goal, versus power and exploitation, and to abuse laws for your own purpose. And so for this Platonic hierarchy, even if you are of, a lower order in terms of the seeking out of wisdom and so forth, you are still considered a member of, the kingdom of God, and that those who seek out wisdom actually have more responsibility for the rest. So it's, again, the opposite. It's not those who have a higher rank have more right for exploitation, but rather those who seek out the wisdom have more responsibility to help bestow it and to protect the others. And so in that sense, like, obviously in society, we need leadership. We need, certain people to help guide a process towards a better path rather than a worse path. And so that's what Ranson's group is about. And again, it's not that, you have to earn your way into the ring by doing this, gross thing or that gross thing, but rather you earn your way in by being a seeker of wisdom through truth, beauty, and goodness. And so, in that sense, it's open to anybody who wishes to enter, but you have to earn it. You have to work towards those understandings. And I would say that in Abolition of Man, that's pretty much also what he's getting at, and this idea of the value system. So in Abolition of Man, he brings up the point, which is and I'll come back actually to Logos because I realized I didn't touch upon that. In Abolition of Man, he's making the point that if you try to strip down value, and if science ultimately looks at nature, including us who are a part of nature, as just things to subject to and exploit for something, at the end of the day, if you have no values, you are only, driven by emotion and desire. And at the end of the day, if you exploit everything, including yourself, what we've created is this somewhat paradoxical situation where we are not, in fact, the conquerors of nature, but nature has, in fact, conquered us, because we've returned to the fold, where we've created a situation where we are not fit to do anything, let alone conquer nature. We've removed the thing about ourselves, which is the soul, which is this part of ourselves that partakes in the sacred, in the divine. That's what gives us any kind of power, and it's situated in the good. Evil can only take power from corrupting the good, and it's a temporary power. It's not, because it doesn't partake in the natural law, it is on a path to its own self-destruction, and it might not be immediate, but that is the ultimate destination point, and there's nothing that you can do to thwart that unless you decide to actually go along with the laws of the universe. And he also makes a very beautiful point in Abolition of Man that, this whole idea of empiricism and always wanting to break it down, right? Break it down. And, the atom, oh, we found the smallest thing that exists. And now we realize, oh, the atom is actually not even like the smallest thing. It's going to be something else. And it's just an obsession to find meaning in something that ultimately is meaningless. But he says that if you try to see through everything, including the first principles, it's akin to not seeing at all. There's a reason why the window is transparent, so that we can see the garden behind it. But if you wish to see past the garden, what is there to see? At a certain point, if you see through everything, it's equivalent to being blind. So I thought that was beautifully said. He ends Abolition of Man on that note. And then with the whole Logos and Britain thing, I mean, I kind of covered it earlier on in our discussion, but yeah, he makes the point. He says, this haunting is no peculiarity of ours. Every people has its own haunter. There's no special privilege for England, no nonsense about a chosen nation with this, whole King Arthur thinger. We speak about Logos because it is our haunting, the one we know about. Those who have forgotten Logos sink into Britain. And again, I think that that's kind of like the culture that represents the soul of the people. If we forget that, then we are lost.
Right. Yeah. Do you have any other questions, Sophie?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
We covered a lot.
Yeah, we did cover a lot. So this was a very fruitful discussion, Cynthia, and that was a great note to end on. We're really grateful for you joining us, and you did a really good job consolidating some very complex ideas. And I know we weren't able to cover everything, but yeah, I definitely would recommend anyone who's listening to check out Cynthia Chung's lecture series on the Science Fiction Trilogy. Where can we find that?
Well, you can look up the Rising Tide Foundation.net is the website address, or you can find us on YouTube just doing Rising Tide Foundation. And yeah, we have a whole bunch of lectures that we have up on our YouTube page.
So
what's next for you? Do you have upcoming projects, that sort of thing? And if listeners want to learn more about what your work is, then where do we go?
The best place is through my Substack, Through a Glass Darkly, or Rising Tide Foundation, obviously. And for my projects, I'm actually working on a book that is going to entail this, as well as the Huxley work that I've been doing, and it will also cover the Theosophists and a whole bunch of stuff. But it's amazing going into this how much it is all connected, with the whole counterculture movement as well, which was an attack on classical culture. Hopefully it will shed a lot of light as to the source of corruption and contamination that has occurred to our culture. And I'll include also, remedies to this, including the work on C.S. Lewis. And I've done a paper on Edgar Poe as well, and Schiller's Ghost Seer, which I think are useful for people to get a positive antidote. Yeah, basically an antidote to all of this sickness that has been shoved down our throats.
All right. Well, Cynthia, thank you so much for joining us. Again, that's the Rising Tide Foundation Canada, her Substack Through a Glass Darkly, and also Strategic Culture Foundation are places that you can find her. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you the best of luck in all of your endeavors and your discussions and really important work that you've been doing here. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Unreliable Narrators, a Mars Hill podcast. Unreliable Narrators is an original podcast produced by STOA alumni. You can subscribe to our podcast wherever podcasts can be found. If you enjoyed this podcast, please visit our website at unreliablenarratorspodcast.wordpress.com or check out our Instagram at Unreliable Narrators Podcast. This podcast is produced by Raymond Okapil and Sophie Klomparens, and our theme music is No New Words by Caleb Klomparens. In our next episode, we'll be discussing Marvel's 2018 animated film Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Until then, friends, if you want to be a part of our inner circle, email us at unreliablenarratorstoa@gmail.com. We're not evil. We're just cool.
There are no new words under the sun.